Being able to understand a few basic physical principles about how ultrasound interacts with various human tissue, as well as having a working knowledge about the key buttons used to control the ultrasound machine, will maximize your ability to acquire quality images in a timely fashion. The 2D or B mode stands for brightness mode, and this is simply white dots on a black background. And this is the reset button on most ultrasound devices that takes off any of the changes you may have made or instrumentation, calipers, things like that. The brightness mode resets it back to its native state. The next button you may encounter is the M mode. The M mode stands for motion mode. And the part of the spike that corresponds to the top of the tissue corresponds to this graphical representation right here of motion. This is a two-dimensional tracing of anything moving on the screen. So structures down here, like this is the plural line right here, because that's sliding back and forth, we see it represented as sandy appearance down here at the bottom of the screen. So motion appears granular, whereas structures that are static over time appear as horizontal lines when using motion mode. And then there's the color flow Doppler. Color flow Doppler is directional flow. Red is flow towards the transducer. Blue is flow away from the transducer. And as we can see here in this aortic aneurysm, there is a turbulent flow kind of going back and forth. And another type of Doppler is called power flow Doppler or color power Doppler. The way you activate that is after depressing the color button, you then activate this by the soft key that corresponds to the power flow power Doppler function. And this is an orange only type of flow. It's not directional. It's a very sensitive type of flow and is used for identifying perfusion in tissue that has a low perfusion state, such as the testicles. And then there's pulsed wave Doppler, sometimes called spectral Doppler. After depressing the Doppler button, you get this sampling gate here, and you can direct where you would like that sampling gate. In this case, it's over the subclavian artery, and we have therefore an arterial waveform. And these are called velocity waveforms, and this is the peak of this spike corresponds to 20 centimeters per second, whereas over here these are venous waveforms. This is the subclavian vein and appears as a much lower flow state, maybe up to approximately 10 centimeters per second. Pulse wave Doppler. Well, the way ultrasound works is the transducer has the piezoelectric effect, meaning that when electricity is applied to it, the crystals shake and the sound gets emitted from the crystals at the ultrasound frequency. That those sound waves travel into the body and then reflect back to the crystals, and the crystals shake again, transducing acoustical energy back into electrical energy, and the machine plots these dots on the screen. And the longer it takes the sound to come back, the further down the field that it will plot the dot. And the denser the tissue, the more echo bright the dot will be, and the less dense the tissue, such as water or urine or bile, the darker the dot will be, so to speak. And so that's how, in a sense, ultrasound works. It depends how deep the tissue is, how long it takes the sound to come back to the probe, and how dense the tissue is how bright the dot will be. And that term brightness is really a better term for it is echogenic. So a structure is hyperechoic if it is more echo bright than the surrounding tissue or more echogenic. Something is hypoechoic if it is less echogenic than the surrounding tissue. And finally, something is anechoic when it is completely devoid of echoes and is jet black compared to the surrounding tissue. The transducers themselves have different frequencies about which they can toggle. And generally speaking, the higher frequency transducers have better resolution but are not able to penetrate as far into the body. So for example, this high frequency linear transducer is really good for superficial structures when depth of penetration is not of concern, whereas this lower frequency transducer here is good for penetrating deeper into the body tissues, such as when you're doing a fast exam or looking at the heart or the aorta, structures that are deeper in the body at the expense of resolution. So you always want to use the highest possible frequency that will get you to the depth of interest. Now you notice that each one of these transducers has a frequency range. So for example, this one goes to 5 to 10 megahertz, 3.5 to 5, 5 to 10, 1 to 5 megahertz. And basically you can toggle the frequencies up or down within each transducer depending on the clinical situation. So let's say that this transducer here goes from 1 to 5 megahertz. This is Morrison's pouch here. This is the reflection of the kidney and the liver. Here's the diaphragm over here. And this says gen or general mode. And so if this transducer goes from 1 to 5 megahertz, the general mode is right in between, say, 3 megahertz. Now if I come over to the soft key and depress that button, now that will toggle me up to the resolution mode. Resolution mode is the high frequency setting on any of the transducers. So for the example from the 1 to 5 megahertz transducer, this would take us up to 5 megahertz. And if you notice, the dots got a little bit more closer together or more resolute. And if I push this button again, I'm going to go to the penetration mode, which is the lower frequency setting. So in this case it would be the 1 megahertz setting, and the dots got a little bit more spread out from one another. So if I go back again, here's resolution, here's general. I'm going to go now take the frequency up to the resolution mode and then down to the penetration mode. So gen, pen, res, the three frequencies about which each transducer can toggle. Now the transducers themselves have different footprints. So for example, this is the C60. It stands for C stands for convex, and 60 the number of millimeters across its surface. Notice that with anytime you're working with an array, the edges of the image splay out from one another and you lose a little bit of lateral resolution. So it's important whenever working with an array transducer to try to center the structure that you're looking at down the center of the screen to take advantage of the fact that the scan lines are a little bit closer together. Now it's not so much of a problem with the C60, but when you get to the phased array transducers where all the sound comes from a single source, then the edges splay out from one another a little more, and you really need to focus a little bit more about getting the structure you're looking at down the center of the screen. Now the advantage to this P21, 21 being the number of millimeters across its surface, short footprint probe, is that now I can get between the ribs. So in other words, I can see from the diaphragm superiorly all the way through the lower pole of the kidney inferiorly when looking at Morrison's pouch using this small footprint probe getting between the ribs. Then there's the linear probe. The linear probes, it's the same resolution all the way across. The scan lines are separated equally, and there's no array of the sound being splayed out from itself on the edges. And so you get the same resolution all the way across. And the linear probe, this is the linear L38 we're looking at here, and they come in all different sizes, L25s, L51s, just depending on what your specific needs are. Again, these tend to be high frequency transducers, good for structures in the near field. But each transducer has an indicator on it. No matter which transducer you're using on any kind of machine, you got to try to locate the indicator, because the indicator has a standard in this country. It's towards the patient's head in a sagittal view and towards the patient's right in a transverse view. So if you look at this inferior vena cava here seen in a sagittal view, this is all towards the head, and over here this is towards the feet. And that's because I've got the indicator towards the head. But if I accidentally aim the indicator down towards the feet because I wasn't paying attention, well, now this IVC is upside down. And when that IVC is upside down, while you can still interpret it, it's an upside down image and goes against the convention in the United States. And over time, that appearance should feel like fingernails on a chalkboard to you. So I'm going to turn it back right now because that's having that effect on me now. And this is the transverse view. We have the indicator towards the patient's right. Same blood vessel, the IVC now seen in a short axis. And we see everything over here is towards the patient's right. Everything over here is towards the patient's left. But just to reiterate this point, this is the sagittal view. And recall that sagittal means longitudinal as approached from the anterior portion of the body. And it's a long axis of the body when we come anteriorly. Transverse, it's as if we're standing below the patient's feet looking up towards the body. I've got the indicator towards the patient's right, and the IVC appears as a short axis. And it's not unlike reading an axial CAT scan where we have everything over here to the right and everything over here towards the patient's left. Now, Coronal is where people can get confused. Coronal also means longitudinal, like sagittal, except now we're getting a longitudinal view from the side of the body. So we've got the probe along the lateral aspect of the body, the indicators towards the patient's head, and that's why we can see the diaphragm up here superiorly, and all the way down through Morrison's pouch, we see the lower pole of the kidney inferiorly. And so this is towards the feet, this is towards the head, and this is a coronal view. It's coming from the side of the body. Now, there's the depth button, and the depth button is important to adjust how deep you want the sound to go into the body. And basically, the longer the sound goes into the body, the deeper the depth will be on the screen. And the way you control that is by pressing this button, the sound will go into the body less deep, and by pushing this button down here, the sound will go into the body more deep. Let me show you a clinical example. This is a patient who's got, this is a small patient who is a pediatric patient who was involved in a motor vehicle crash. And basically, when we look over here at Morrison's pouch, we can see that from the skin